The order was simple, and it made no sense. No man was to load his musket. No man was to fire under any circumstances, for any reason, until the fort had been taken. If a soldier loaded his weapon and discharged it before the signal was given, the officer nearest him was to kill him on the spot. Not court-martial him afterward. Kill him in the moment. 1,300 men were about to assault the most heavily fortified British position on the Hudson River. The garrison inside had artillery covering every approach from the water. They had rows of sharpened logs angled outward around the entire perimeter at angles designed to stop a man moving at a crouch and entangle a man trying to run. They had approximately 600 soldiers behind those walls, with loaded weapons, clear fields of fire, and the high ground. The only land approach to the fort was a tidal causeway through marsh that flooded completely at high tide. Compressing every possible route into a strip of ground narrow enough for a single file of men, directly beneath the guns above. The Americans were going in on foot, in the dark, in silence, with bayonets on weapons they were forbidden to fire. What happened in the 30 minutes after midnight on July 16, 1779, was the most precisely executed assault of the entire Revolutionary War, carried out by men who could not shoot back. Stony Point does not look, on a map, like a place anyone should be asked to attack. The promontory juts into the Hudson River from the western bank in New York, approximately 30 miles north of the city. Water runs along three sides of the high ground. The terrain rises steeply from the river on the flanks, and the only land connection to the mainland runs through a strip of marshy causeway that the tide covers completely at high water. Every officer who looked at the position in the spring and summer of 1779 reached the same conclusion. A frontal assault across that causeway, under fire from above, against a fortified garrison, would not succeed. It would produce casualties on the causeway and a withdrawal. The approach was a killing ground constructed by geography before the British improved upon it. The British had seized Stony Point in May 1779, evicting a small American garrison without significant resistance. General Sir Henry Clinton ordered the position fortified and garrisoned as part of a strategy to control the Hudson River corridor, which Washington needed open to connect his forces in New England with those further south. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Johnson was placed in command. Johnson was given experienced troops, adequate supplies, and clear orders: make the position defensible against any American force that might attempt to retake it. Johnson did thorough work. His engineers constructed a bodice across every approach to the high ground, overlapping rows of sharpened logs with the points angled outward and downward to catch a man moving fast through them in the dark. The layers were staggered so that a force breaking through the outer row encountered a second row before it could reorganize and advance again. Artillery was sighted to cover the river approaches, the causeway, and the high ground on either side of the marsh. The walls of the inner fort commanded the slope below them. A garrison standing behind those walls with loaded muskets, firing downhill at men entangled in a bodice, would be in about as favorable a position as 18th century military engineering could construct. Washington surveyed Stony Point personally in late June 1779, accompanied by Anthony Wayne, and arrived at a conclusion that his engineers had already formed independently. A conventional assault in daylight was not survivable. A night assault that alerted the garrison before the attacking columns reached the walls would produce the same result as a daylight assault, only with less visibility for the attackers. Whatever was going to succeed at Stony Point had to achieve complete surprise, had to arrive from multiple directions at once so the garrison could not concentrate its fire, and had to move through the abattis without slowing down long enough to be shot while crossing it. Washington selected Anthony Wayne to plan and lead the operation. Wayne was 34 years old, a brigadier general from Pennsylvania with a reputation for aggressive forward action that made him useful in precisely this kind of situation. He was given approximately 1,300 men and 2 weeks to work out the details of a plan that had no margin for error. The British confidence in Stony Point was not unreasonable. It rested on two things that had been consistently true throughout the war, and both were observable facts rather than wishful thinking. The first was the record of American night operations. Coordinating multiple columns in darkness over unfamiliar ground, arriving at the same objective simultaneously without communicating by light or sound, required a level of tactical discipline and unit cohesion that the Continental Army had not yet demonstrated convincingly. The attempt at Germantown in 1777, where 4 columns had converged on the British position in fog and early morning darkness, had ended with American units firing into each other before the assault collapsed entirely. Every British officer who had served in North America long enough to study the pattern understood that complexity worked against the Continentals. The more moving parts a plan required, the more likely something essential would fail at the moment it was needed most. The Continental Army could fight. What it had not been able to do reliably was execute a multi-column night movement to a single objective and arrive in coordination. The British had observed this limitation across 3 years of the war and had no evidence it had been corrected. The second was the physical design of Stony Point itself. The position had been constructed with American tactics specifically in mind. The abatis would entangle any force attempting to push through it under fire. A force that slowed in the abatis, while a garrison on the high ground above it fired down at close range from prepared positions, would not survive long enough to reach the walls. The artillery covered the causeway, the only avenue a large body of men could use at anything other than low tide, and the steep flanks on either side of the promontory offered no practical alternative at night to men who had not reconnoitered them in daylight. The inner walls commanded the approach from every direction that remained. Johnson had arrayed his men behind those walls and in front of those guns because that was where a professional officer was supposed to be in a position like this one. He had no reason to doubt the math. Clinton in New York had distributed his forces along the Hudson with Stony Point as a secure anchor. He was monitoring river traffic and watching for concentrations of Continental troops that would reveal Washington's actual intention for the summer campaign. He was alert to the possibility of an American move north or south. He was not watching the marsh at the base of his fortified promontory at midnight in July. He had not been told, and had no means of knowing, that 2 weeks of careful planning in the hills above Haverstraw had produced an answer to every advantage his position held. Wayne's plan answered Stony Point's defenses by refusing to fight the engagement those defenses had been built to win. The abatis would entangle a force that moved through it in a hurry under fire. So the abatis would be dealt with before the main columns arrived. Parties of selected men were assigned specifically to cut passages through the sharpened logs in the dark ahead of the columns, working by touch and by sound, without light, opening gaps wide enough for the men behind them to move through without slowing. These cutting parties went first. They understood that if the garrison heard them, they were dead before the column even reached the outer works. The garrison would respond to musket fire by concentrating its own fire on the source, so there would be no musket fire from the attackers. Every man in the assault force would carry his musket with a fixed bayonet and an empty barrel. The order Wayne issued before the march was not a request, and it was not open to interpretation. Any man who loaded his weapon and fired before the fort was taken would be killed by the officer nearest him. This converted the temptation to fire into something more immediately dangerous than the enemy. The silence of the approach was the primary weapon, more valuable than any number of individual shots could be. The garrison could not defend 2 walls simultaneously if attacks arrived from 2 directions at once. Wayne divided his force into flanking columns, approaching through the marsh on either side of the causeway at low tide when the ground was passable. Each column was led by a forlorn hope, a volunteer advance party whose specific assignment was to reach the walls first, absorb the initial concentrated fire, and keep moving regardless of casualties so the men behind them could enter the breach while the garrison was reloading. The volunteers for the forlorn hope were told precisely what they were being asked to do. They went anyway. Lieutenant Colonel François de Fleury, a French officer serving in the Continental Army, led the advance party of the Southern Column. Congress had announced that the first man over the walls would receive a silver medal. De Fleury intended to earn it. The advance party of the Northern Column was led by Lieutenant Colonel John Stewart. Between the two flanking attacks, a smaller central element approached the causeway directly, making deliberate noise, lighting torches, drawing the garrison's attention to the front while the real assault came from both sides. The march from the assembly point began at 8 in the evening on July 15th. 14 miles to the start line. Every dog along the route had been killed in the preceding days to prevent barking as the column passed in darkness. A farmer who encountered the force near Haverstraw was detained under guard until the assault was complete. Wayne had eliminated every possible source of premature alarm he could identify. 1,300 men moved through the summer night without a light, without a signal, and without a word beyond what officers could whisper to the men directly at their side. The tide reached its low point shortly after midnight. The columns entered the marsh. If you are here for the plan's history forgot to explain, subscribe now. What happened when that silence reached the walls is the reason Stony Point is in the record at all. At approximately midnight, the Southern Column reached the outer abatis. The cutting party went to work in the dark. The garrison on the walls above them heard nothing. The passages opened. The column began moving through. De Fleury moved at the front of the Forlorn Hope. A British sentry saw movement below the walls and fired. The alarm went up. Drums shouted commands. The garrison came to its positions. From that moment, Wayne had perhaps 3 minutes, certainly no more, before the British could concentrate enough muskets on the breaches to stop the columns entirely. The men who had been moving in controlled silence began to run. Officers who had been whispering began to shout. The Forlorn Hope parties drove through the abatis and up the slope toward the walls with bayonets forward and empty muskets in their hands. Wayne was struck before he cleared the outer works. A musket ball caught him in the head, grazing the skull and dropping him to the ground. He was conscious. He gave an order to the men around him, "Carry me into the fort." If he was going to die, he intended to die inside the walls. His men picked him up and carried him forward through the breach. De Fleury reached the inner fort and went over the wall. He tore down the British flag with his own hands. He was first, as he had meant to be. The Northern Column came over the opposite wall moments later. The garrison found itself receiving bayonet assaults from 2 directions simultaneously, with no formed perimeter left to defend. No time to reload between shots at targets that were already inside the walls, and no reserve to plug 2 breaches at once. The fighting inside was brief. British soldiers who attempted to continue resistance encountered bayonets at close range in darkness. Those who surrendered were taken. Henry Johnson was captured in the confusion, still attempting to organize a defense in a fort that was already gone. The British flag was down. American voices were calling across the interior of the works from 2 sides. It was over. The assault, from the moment the sentry fired to the moment the fort was taken, lasted approximately 30 minutes. The count taken in the hours afterward was precise, and the numbers told the complete story. British dead, 63. British wounded, approximately 70. British taken prisoner, 543. Nearly the entire garrison was dead, wounded, or captured. The artillery that Clinton had considered sufficient to defend the position, the supplies stockpiled inside the fort, the fortifications that Johnson had spent weeks constructing, were all in American hands before the sun came up over the Hudson. American dead, 15. American wounded, 83. The distance between those two sets of figures is the exact measure of what Wayne's plan had achieved against a position designed to produce a very different arithmetic. The fort had been built to kill attacking infantry in the abatis and on the causeway at a distance under massed fire from elevated positions. The attacking infantry had not fought from the causeway. They had passed the abatis in darkness before the garrison was fully alert. They had arrived at the walls before the artillery could be depressed to a useful angle. They had come from two directions at once, which meant every musket the garrison pointed at one column was a musket not pointed at the other. The unloaded muskets, the order that had seemed irrational the moment it was issued, were the reason the approach had worked. A single premature discharge in the marsh would have put 600 alerted soldiers on the walls with time to organize before the columns arrived. The silence was not a constraint on the assault. It was the assault. The bayonet was the tool. The plan had removed every advantage the fort was designed to hold. De Fleury received his silver medal from Congress, one of the very few awarded to a non-American officer during the war. Wayne received a gold medal, one of only 8 presented by Congress across the entire conflict. Johnson was paroled in the days following his capture and eventually exchanged in the standard process. He had built a position generally considered impregnable and lost it in 30 minutes to men who had not fired a shot. Washington ordered Stony Point evacuated shortly after the assault. Holding it permanently against a British counterattack from New York would require a garrison too large to spare, and a fixed garrison of that size was not the kind of use Washington could afford to make of his army. The cannon were removed. The stores were removed. The fortifications were demolished. By the time Clinton moved to retake it, there was nothing left to take. The strategic value had never been the ground. It was the demonstration. What would you have done, standing on that causeway in the dark, musket unloaded by order, listening to a sentry fire above you and knowing the garrison was awake and the alarm was going? Every man in that column faced that choice in the same instant. The ones who kept moving, who went forward without firing because they had been told not to fire, are the reason the assault worked. The impact of Stony Point on British strategic thinking along the Hudson was immediate and measurable. Clinton reinforced multiple positions he had previously considered secure, shifting experienced troops from mobile operations to garrison duty up and down the river. The knowledge that a continental force could move 14 miles in darkness, cross a tidal marsh in silence, breach a fortified position with fixed bayonets, and take the garrison prisoner in under an hour was not easily absorbed by a command structure that had built its confidence on the impregnability of prepared works. Every British officer on the Hudson looked at his defenses differently after July 16, 1779. The question was no longer whether the Continentals would attack a fortified position. The question was which position they would choose next and whether the garrison would hear them coming. For the Continental Army, the effect was the inverse. Stony Point was proof of what the Army had become since the winter of 1777 to 1778. The bayonet assault, the coordinated approach of multiple columns in darkness, the maintenance of silence and unit cohesion through a 14-mile night march and a breach under fire, none of that was possible for the army that had drifted backward at Brandywine. It was the product of a training program that had not existed before Friedrich von Steuben stood on a parade ground in Pennsylvania and drilled 100 men in the movements they had never been taught to a standard. The army that took Stony Point in 30 minutes was a different instrument than the one that had lost its shape under pressure at Germantown. The British had not yet fully recalibrated to what they were facing. Anthony Wayne commanded American forces in the South during the later stages of the war and in the Northwest Territory in the 1790s, where he defeated a Confederation at the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794. He died in December 1796 at a military post on Lake Erie of complications from gout at the age of 51. He spent most of his adult life under orders. What the record shows about Stony Point, removed from the version that reduces it to a story about courage under fire, is a story about precision. The fort was not taken because the men who attacked it were braver than the men who defended it. 63 British soldiers died inside those walls before the position fell. The garrison of Johnson's fought. They came to the walls when the alarm was raised. They fired into the dark at columns they could hear, but not always see. The fort was taken, in spite of all of that, because one man spent 2 weeks examining every reason the assault should fail and removed those reasons methodically before the column took its first step. No premature noise. No gunfire to alert the garrison early. Passages cut through the outer obstacle before the main body arrived so the advance would not slow down at the worst possible moment. The garrison's attention drawn to the front while the genuine threat arrived from both flanks at once, leaving no coherent response available. The plan was the weapon. Everything else was execution. What is easy to lose in the accounting of the plan is what the plan asked from the men who carried it out. 14 miles on foot through a summer night, in silence, without knowing whether the man ahead of you could be heard by the garrison above. Crossing a tidal marsh in darkness, wet to some degree before the assault even began, with no visibility and no possibility of signal. Moving through the abatis by feel, in file, with a weapon you had been forbidden to fire and an order that made firing it more dangerous than the enemy fire coming the other way. Following a forlorn hope party into a gap in the sharpened logs and up a slope toward walls with muskets on them, with nothing in your hands that you were permitted to use at range, because the plan said the bayonet was sufficient and you were committed to the plan. The men who went first through the abatis, who cut the passages in the dark for the columns behind them, who composed the forlorn hope on both flanks, knowing they would absorb the first concentrated fire the garrison could deliver, are not the prominent figures in the record of Stony Point. Wayne is in the record. De Fleury is in the record. Johnson is in the record. The men who cut the passages are not in any record that has survived with their names attached. The volunteers of the forlorn hope on the northern and southern columns are in the casualty lists. 15 killed, 83 wounded. Wayne received his gold medal from Congress. De Fleury received his silver medal and returned to France after the war. The 15 men who did not come back from Stony Point are in the casualty lists and nowhere else. That is where the real record of July 16, 1779 lives. Not in the medal citations. In those numbers. If that is what you came here for, you are in the right place.